I just suddenly saw myself as in the wrong place, doing the wrong things, and I wanted to get away from everything I knew. And really what I first wanted to do was to take my life. I just wanted out. There comes a moment where you just start saying to yourself, what's the point?
Age 37, you star in a play, which again called Cellmates, I believe.
That's right.
The play gets some pretty harsh reviews, to say the least, from a lot of the big newspapers as such. And that's another real low moment in your life. Where,
hugely so.
Can you take me back to that moment?
I was never comfortable in the play, and I was beginning to feel lost and adrift and deeply unhappy, and I couldn't understand why. The play wasn't that much of a disaster. I mean, it had good audiences, and they applauded at the end. And some people said, "Yeah, I don't think it's his best play," but it's a lot. It wasn't an absolute catastrophe, shall we say? At
this point, because this is important context, you're well established.
Yes,
yes. In writing,
yes,
in
things
acting.
like Blackadder and Jeeves and Wooster and Fry and Laurie had happened, and my books had been selling. So I was, in the public eye, I was well known. And anyway, one Saturday, there was a Saturday night. I guess the press night had been on Friday or something like that. So we then had a Saturday night. And then on Sunday, there were the Sunday papers, of which I saw some of which were deeply unkind to me. And that did make a difference. I mean, I've said I didn't go just because I didn't like the reviews. It wasn't entirely that. That would have been a bit weak, and certainly was a weak thing to have done anyway. But it was a whole concatenation of something wrong in my head. I just suddenly saw myself as in the wrong place, doing the wrong things, and I wanted to get away from everything I knew. And really what I first wanted to do was to take my life. And I did run the car engine in the lock-up garage of the flat where I was in London, and then realised it was a catalytic converter and that it wasn't really going to do much harm to me. And then there was stuff of it, and I was just coughing a bit. And
that's quite a significant decision to make following.
I know. I just wanted out, really. That's it. Wherever I was, I wanted to be somewhere else, and if it was nowhere, that would be at first. That was the most perfect place to be. I just didn't see as anybody listening who's had the misfortune and the terror of considering taking their life, suicidal ideation, as it's known in the trade, they will probably concur with me that there comes a moment where you just start saying to yourself, "What's the point?" It's a strange phrase because anyone could say it at any point, but there's some moments when you say it, it seems so truthful that there is simply no point in anything around oneself, and that's how it seems. Anyway, so I got in the car and drove to the south coast to Dover, I think it was, Folkestone, and got on a ferry to Zeebrugge in Belgium, and then ended up in Bruges. In Bruges, like Colin Farrell and Brendan. And I then wandered a little further east into Holland, and then into Germany and Hanover and Hamburg.
And you didn't tell anybody you were
No. And this was 93 or so. There was no World Wide Web as such. It was just beginning to happen. Tim Berners-Lee in Switzerland was beginning to develop the World Wide Web. But there were these things called commercial online servers like CompuServe in America Online, rather than direct kind of internet connections. And I had been connected to those for some time, and I'd taken my computer with me, I guess. So I was in a hotel in Hamburg, and then I got a message from my friend Hugh, who said, "Old fellow, you must come home. Be in touch at least." And so I kind of sent him an email on this CompuServe thing, and I agreed that it was nonsense. I had this in my head, this idea that I would go up from Hamburg and Hanover up Schleswig-Holstein, which is the border with Denmark and go up into Denmark. And somehow in the north of Denmark, I would sit on a rock in a thick white pullover with a pipe clenched between my teeth, writing impossible poetry and teaching English to Danes and be forgotten, and just live the rest of my life there. Total fantasy. But no, Hugh said, come on, it's fine. Come home. We really want to see you. Everyone wants to. And so I drove back overnight to Amsterdam, and my father had got a flight to Schiphol, and we met in a hotel in Schiphol, and then got a flight, little aeroplane back to Southend. And
what did you say to your father that day in Amsterdam when you met him?
I said, you've spent your life getting me out of terrible and embarrassing holes, and this is probably the worst of them. And he said, no, it isn't. It's fine. It's all okay. And he was just wonderful.
I watched a news report of your absence.
Really?
Yeah, I watched it upstairs before we had this conversation of I think it was maybe BBC News or one of the big stations reporting that you had you were basically missing.
Yeah.
They had a big picture of you on the screen and saying that you had, the way that they'd framed it obviously is they said you did this play. They showed some of the headlines, some of the reviews, and they said Stephen Fry's vanished.
Oh my God.
And everyone was very...
Of course, I never saw any of that. I did see a photograph someone sent me years later of police on the roof of my house in Norfolk, which was slightly disturbing, looking for signs of me and obviously feeling the worst. Oh, it was a strange event. But in some ways it was a cleansing or a necessary step, I suppose, because as a result of it, I went to see psychiatrists and started to try and work out why my mind was taking me into such impossible dark places, or, when I had so much to be thankful for. I mean, what the hell? I had enough money. I was well regarded in my profession. Why should I have come to such a crisis just because someone didn't like my performance in that play? It's not really good enough. And I'm not that hypersensitive. So that started what I suppose we have to call my journey into my mental health. And a few years later, can't remember when, well, quite a few years later, probably about 8 or 9, if not 10 years later, I made a program at the BBC, or two episodes, I think it was, called The Secret Life of the Manic Depressive, in which I tried to explore this peculiarity of this darkness that can shroud a mind so completely, but also that is part of an illness that I hadn't really understood. I'd heard the phrase manic depression, and I'd never really heard the word manic. Manic depression is two illnesses. Depression, which is a dark, depressed, lowered, as in depressed state, and mania is an elevated state of energy and full of bounce and vigor and a desire to communicate with people. And depression is the exact opposite. You just want to lie in bed and pull the duvet over your head and never speak to anybody. Whereas when you're in a manic state, you're always on the phone boring people. So there are two poles, and hence it's also known bipolar. There's the one pole of mania, hypermania, and the other pole of a depressed state.
As I read through your story, even up until 10 years ago, I could see that you were still having moments of real lows, real depressive lows. I listened to, I think, a podcast episode you did where you said when you were 55, it was, I believe, your third suicide attempt in your life.
Yes, Fred, that's right, yeah. I think, it is in that sense what doctors call chronic, like asthma. You can, have an inhaler on you and usually be sort of safe, and you know what you're allergic to, what triggers an asthma attack. But you never stop being an asthmatic, and the day could come when you least expect it. When, of course, it's always the day you've forgotten your inhaler, where suddenly you just get this enormous attack and you can barely breathe. And it might have been 10 years since you last had such one. I'm sure anyone listening who has lived with asthma will know what I mean. And it's a bit like that with you've at your peril, do you think you've conquered it? You are living with it and coping with it and managing it. And most of the time, one manages it, but sometimes you hear it, the hoofbeats back in your brain of the coming storm, and you do everything you can to avoid it and tell friends now. That's it's so much easier said than done. I have a theory, I call it my genital wart theory, is we all say how important friends are. Gosh, we need friends. Friends are the people you can say anything to, aren't they? But actually they're not. If you had a genital wart, you wouldn't show it to your best friend. You'd say, oh, Tom, here, have a look at my blonde teeth. There we go. Shut up. Similarly, you wouldn't show it to your mother, or to your sister, and that's family. But you show it to a stranger, a doctor. So can you look at this and tell me if it's normal or all right? And they'll go, oh, that's fine, don't worry. And you feel okay. So if that's true of some little physical part of yourself, it's also true of the mental part of yourself, that although you have family and friends who are supposed to be there for you, it's actually very difficult, even though you know it's the right thing to do, to share with them what you're thinking. It's very hard. And they'd be upset nearly always when you have a crisis. If it gets as far as suicide, obviously even more so. But they say, why didn't you come and tell me? They're actually angry with you. You know I'm there for you. Why didn't you come? Well, because I was a genital wart in my mind, as it were. And you just feel, and you have to try and overcome that. But yes, I have to be aware it won't necessarily go away.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.